This happened a few years ago. It was pretty late, past 2 a.m., and I was living with my ex who was pretty abusive, and he had gotten really jealous at this party that we were at earlier that night. Not even an hour after we'd gotten home, he tossed me out onto the porch and locked the door behind me. I was knocking and pleading for him to let me back inside. I was still wearing what I'd worn to the party and it was freezing out. I wasn't sure what to do. He had my phone, purse, and wallet in the house with him, so I just sat on the porch crying. When he turned off the lights both inside and out of the house, I knew he wasn't going to let me back in. I felt so helpless and cold. I thought about knocking on a neighbour's door, though we didn't have very many, but I had anxiety about waking them up and causing trouble for my boyfriend. So instead I decided I would try and walk to the gas station and motel, which was like less than a mile away, so I could try use their phone and call a friend of mine and see if I could sleep over at her house. A little bit into the walk, this tall, white pickup truck was approaching on the opposite side of the road that I was on. I tried not to make eye contact for obvious reasons, but then I heard the truck stopping and making a U-turn, and my heart just started pounding. I just about froze up, but I forced myself to speed walk at the very least. The truck pulled up beside me and a guy rolled down his window and asked me what I was doing out this late. I told him I was going to meet my friend at the gas station and she was expecting me. He sort of smiled and offered me a ride. I said no thank you, citing that I shouldn't hitchhike. He told me, well good, I don't pick up hitchhikers or anyone, but you don't look like a hitchhiker though. You look like you just need some help. He just kept driving next to me and told me that I shouldn't think he was a creep, and he pulled out what looked like a police badge and told me he had just gotten off duty, which was why he was in civilian clothes and out so late. He said he wouldn't mind driving next to me just to make sure I get to where I was heading safely. I was naive and a little bit too trusting of his kindness and his credentials, and when he offered me a ride again, I said that it would be nice because the gas station wasn't that far away anyway. He popped the door open for me and I hopped in. The radio was low. It was a little messy. The ashtray was full of cigarettes. There were a lot of newspapers on the passenger floor. As I was moving my feet, some of the papers shifted, showing a pair of handcuffs, some coffee cups, empty water bottles, rags, a highlight-coloured bandana, and some other things. He apologised, saying that it was the truck he took hunting, but it was super warm, so I was happy and I didn't mind at all. He told me his name was John. He asked why I was so scantily dressed without a jacket, and I started to tell him all about the party and the fight I'd had with my boyfriend. He was super charming and attentive. He even laughed that he could go back and arrest him. I asked about him, and he told me about his family. He was a young dad. He had a wife, a daughter, a son, and a dog. And I told him that it was like he had the perfect little family. And he laughed and said he certainly did. Then it sort of clicked for me to ask him if I could use his phone, but he said no because he had to save his battery. We were approaching the gas station, and he drove right past it. I politely said, "Oh, I think that's the one," but he didn't answer me. I felt sick to my stomach. My heart started pounding. I started getting choked up. My eyes started tearing up as I was looking out the windows and watching the lights behind us get further and further away. It was hard for me to even speak, but somehow I murmured, asking if he could please turn around, and he ignored me again. Whenever I would look at him, he would just look empty-eyed and emotionless, totally dead and glazed. I looked back out the window and down the road to see if maybe we were going slow enough that I could maybe make a leap out of the car without seriously injuring myself. I remember always hearing, never go to the second location, but I thought about the possibility of jumping out and breaking an ankle and how hard it would be to get away with just 1 foot as opposed to 2. Debating with myself that there was a lot of snow on the ground, but then again, snow is hard to get along in, especially when you're not fully clothed. I felt so dumb now too, because I wasn't even tied up or anything. I was just so scared though. Like, there was nothing but trees, an empty road, and us. I was crying pretty badly at this point, and I asked if I could borrow his phone again. I don't know why I even asked this, and he just told me to stop talking. Then he started talking underneath his breath, saying, "Girls shouldn't be out so late. You shouldn't be out alone like this. You shouldn't be out alone this late. Look what you've done. Look what you're doing to me. Just like a slut." And other derogatory things. As he kept saying these terrible things, way too many to say on here, I wasn't even responding. I was just crying and trying to think past the fear I was feeling. I remembered the handcuffs on the floor, so I used that little, I don't know how to describe it, like scoopy motion. Managed to use my feet to scoop the handcuffs up and use my heel and my toes to push them under the bottom of my seat as far as I could. I was thinking of different things I could do to try and help myself, like if we were close enough to some upcoming lights or structures, if I ever made it to them, I could just grab the wheel and cause us to crash into them. Or maybe how if I got lucky enough for a cop to pass us, I could just grab the wheel and swerve so it would appear he was drunk and a drunk driver, so maybe we'd get pulled over. I thought about the possibility that if this man was just having a weird night and how if I did do anything, it might hurt him, but I also told myself that this sort of thinking is what got me into this mess. He pulled off-road where there were still woods on both sides of us. On his side, the wooded trees were closer to the road, but on my side, there was a small gap fully covered in thick snow. Before the trees thickly picked up, maybe 10 to 16 yards away, he turned off the car and coldly said that there was something wrong with the car and to get out with him. As he grabbed the keys and was stepping out of the car, I grabbed onto the centre console and cried and pleaded not to make me get out with him because it was too cold. He turned around to face me, his door still open, and shouted at me to get out of the car because we had to go check out the trunk bed hatch. I dug my fingernails deep into the console, thinking my cries of no and head shaking would cause him to come around to my side of the car and drag me out himself. I was crying and said, "Please, John, I'm so cold, I'm scared." I was thinking of everything I ever heard. Humanize yourself. Use first names. He stared at me in this way that I can't even describe to this day, and I don't even know how to start. He got back in the car and I slinked towards my window, scared he would drag me over the console. He turned off the headlights and everything just looked dark blue. He stared at the steering wheel for what felt like years before lighting a cigarette and looking out of his window, and then back to me, and then back out of his window. He heard me shuffle my feet on the newspapers. I was just adjusting my legs. But while still staring out of the window, he told me if I thought about running, he had a quick way to get me back where he wanted me. And oddly enough, I was sort of thinking of running minutes before that, but reasoned that if he wanted me out of the car, then I should definitely stay in. Otherwise, he could try and chase me or shoot me in case he had his hunting rifles in the back. I didn't dare look. I'm glad I was right. I think at that point I sort of hit some sort of bottom of my reserve, and instead of panic, there was just this numbness and exhaustion. There was still an occasional hot tear or two, but I just remember feeling so numb. I talked to a psychiatrist about this sort of thing, and he thinks it just came from my ex-boyfriend giving me PTSD. It was dead quiet, but I finally, just barely audibly, told him that my friend was still waiting for me and asked about his wife and children, and he flatly said he didn't have a wife or children and that his house was empty. I asked him what he was thinking about, and he said, "I'm thinking of what to do with you." He didn't say it angrily, he just said it flatly and coldly, which sort of scared me even more. I did start getting worked back up to a cry at that point, and he told me not to cry and turned the car on, offering some heat. And he turned the car on, offering me some heat. I just cried and said I wanted to go home. Eventually, he started driving and kept driving until we were approaching a gas station. I was gauging the right time to reach for the steering wheel, but before I could, he started slowing down. While pulling up, he told me not to tell anyone, or he would find me. Then he told me all he was doing was teaching me a lesson not to hitchhike with strangers. He was almost coming to a complete stop when he told me to get out before he changes his mind. Before he could even get another look towards me to assess my understanding, I was already down out of the truck sprinting towards the gas station. The panic was overwhelming me, but then I stopped and remembered to try and see his license plate. I turned around but only caught the blur of the last 3 numbers as he was driving off. I ran inside and asked the clerk behind the counter to please call the police. I waited until the officer got there, and I'll be honest, I was a little scared it would be John. My fears melted away when the new-faced policeman got there. I gave him the description of John, his appearance, the vehicle colour and type, the parts of the license plate number I had caught, the fact he said he was an off-duty cop, just basically anything I could. I asked him if he could look at the camera, and the officer disappeared in the back for a little bit, then came back out saying there was nothing on them. I asked if I would be able to look, and the officer said no and asked me if I didn't trust him, and I told him of course I did. The officer gave me a ride to my friend's house, lecturing me for hitchhiking, constantly, repeatedly asking me if I knew who Ted Bundy was. I never heard anything back about the report that was made, but at the end of the day, I'm just really glad I didn't get out of the car in the woods that night. I hope this helps other people and they take something from this story, because it could have been so much worse for me had I gotten out. This happened when I was a freshman in college and lived in a tiny 2-bedroom house in one of the off-campus neighbourhoods with another girl. In an effort to make friends aside from my roommate, I spent as much time as possible on campus after classes. I would usually study in the library for a few hours or go to the student gym, and whenever I was at the gym, I would always run into this guy named Justin. I never saw him do any real workouts. Most of the time he would just walk on the treadmill for a few minutes. It was clear that his intention wasn't to exercise but to lurk around and bother the girls that were there, me being one of them. He would always come up to me and start talking to me when I was in the middle of a set. I would barely acknowledge him, trying to maybe just give him a courteous nod so that he could leave me alone. And that's when Justin took it as a green light to start flirting with me, rudely disregarding my workout. I would try to avoid him, but it was clear he'd never got the message. Unfortunately, during those early days of college, I was in a vulnerable spot, moving away from home and going to new school, made me feel shy, so I didn't have the guts to just straight up tell him to shove off, like I wanted to. Eventually, over time, we started to form this weird friendship of some sort. After he asked me for my Snapchat a bunch of times, I caved and gave it to him. From then on, we would snap each other occasionally, but obviously he was a lot more active in the conversation than I was. I wanted him to lose interest and leave me alone, but for some reason I felt compelled to consider him a friend, since I lacked having any. But this would all come back to bite me. When I started randomly running into Justin more often, we never made plans to hang out, but he had the tendency to pop up wherever I went around the campus. I avoided him whenever I could, but he was often able to corner me into unwanted conversations where he would habitually ask to walk me home. I always found some sort of way to decline. There was no way I wanted him to know where I lived. However, by the time I started to realise how creepy Justin was, it was already too late. One night at around 2 o'clock in the morning, I was awoken by a notification. I would usually sleep through, but I was having trouble sleeping that night because of all the stress from Justin, just like low-key stalking me. So I rolled over to check it out, and to my severe disappointment, it was a Snapchat from Justin. I should have left it on delivery for the night, but in a momentary lapse of thinking, I opened it and I was shocked. It was a picture of him standing in the bathroom mirror with nothing but a towel, and he was soliciting me with a caption saying, "Send a nude." I was so disgusted that I couldn't even stomach replying to it, so I left it unread and tried to go back to sleep. But a few minutes later, Justin sent me another Snapchat, and at this point, I was curious to see how deep he would dig himself into this hole, and what I saw was somehow more disturbing than the mirror. Picture was a selfie of him with tears running down his face. He was actually crying this time. This was more disturbing coming from an adult. The caption read, "Why are you leaving me on red like this?" I just felt so embarrassed, just for even thinking we could be friends, and I was losing my patience. So despite the fact that he'd already crossed several lines, I gave him the grace of texting, and I said, "Please leave me alone." I sent that message and I rolled over to go to sleep, but that's when I heard multiple Snapchat notifications from Justin, but I ignored them for as long as I could. However, the whole situation was causing me to toss and turn, but without getting any good rest, I finally gave up after about an hour and checked my phone. The series of snaps I opened in that moment made my blood curdle. The first one was a picture of his feet up on a public bus with a caption saying he was on his way, but what was seemingly just a harmless back and forth interaction came all the more disturbing when I saw his next Snapchat. It was a snap in front of my house saying he was here. I freaked out and sat up in bed. It was clear he already knew where I lived, but it wasn't over yet. That alone was bad, but it was the third snap that made me know I had to get the police involved. It was a snap of a picture looking through a gap between a set of doors, a picture of me sleeping in my bed with the caption, "You look so beautiful when you're asleep." In a heartbeat, I sprang out of bed and sprinted out of the room. Right as Justin burst from my closet and started chasing after me, he nearly got me, but I was able to get to the bathroom down the hall and lock the door behind me. A second later, he was banging on the door repeatedly. All I could do was threaten to call the cops, but it seemed like he wasn't going to leave until I surrendered myself. I collapsed with my back pressed against the door, and as I sat on the bathroom floor wailing, under my breath, I actually couldn't call the cops. I ran out of the room so fast that I left my phone on my bed. Luckily, my roommate just so happened to be in the other room. She had awoken to the chaos and got up to lock her door and call the police for me. About 10 very tense minutes later, the cops showed up. Justin didn't even try to run. He folded and let them take him away, sobbing like a big baby the whole time. Afterwards, I had the conversation with my roommate about how he was able to find out where I lived. But the very first thing that she said to me was, "Did you leave your snap map on?" I immediately had the biggest facepalm moment of my life because that's exactly what it was. The snap was a new feature back then, and I wasn't thinking much about it until that moment. However, I also learned how little the college cared about my safety. When the cops ran Justin's background, they found multiple instances of aggravated stalking, yet somehow he was allowed to just wander around the campus all this time. I had to drive back from a 16-hour drive, which I planned on taking all in one go. I'm a female, and I always considered myself to be very independent. Before departing, I stopped at a gas station to fill up on gas and get a snack. At a very busy cluster of gas stations in the middle of nowhere. It was a few hours shy of Sacramento. I parked off to the side after gassing up so I could stretch my legs and use the bathroom and replenish my road snacks in Red Bull in preparation for the road trip. I didn't notice anything out of the ordinary, and I got back on the road. When I was about an hour in, I got a tyre pressure warning light signal on my dashboard. Normally, I'd stop on the side of the road to assess the situation, but something in my gut told me not to. It was a very empty stretch of highway with curves and a very soft shoulder. The vehicle seemed to be handling it fine. Also, it was a rental, and I paid for extended insurance, so I wasn't too worried about it. I eventually hopped out of the left lane and noticed a sign for a town that was 9 miles up the road. I decided to take a chance and made my way to a small valero next to what looked like an abandoned diner. I pulled in with hopes of finding an air pump in case there was a slow tyre leak. I didn't see one, so I parked and got out of the vehicle. I immediately heard a hissing sound and watched the tyre slowly sink until the rim touched the ground. It was definitely inconvenient, but I figured a rental SUV would have a full-size spare, so I checked the trunk and found a donut tyre. I got on the phone with Enterprise and they said that they could send someone to put the spare tyre on in about an hour. I was annoyed, so I said no thanks, I'll just do it myself in 10 minutes. They also gave me the option to swap the car out in Sacramento the following day. It was Sunday, so all the car shops near me were closed. I decided that I would put the tyre on myself, then possibly swap it out the next day. Once I started working on the tyre, I had to wave off a very nice Good Samaritans, but one car in particular, with about 3 males, were being extra pushy about helping. Rona luckily gave me an added excuse in requesting that they keep their distance and go about their way. I spoke loudly and firm enough in my assistance that I caught the attention of a few other people in the vicinity, standing over at the gas pumps. Eventually they gave up and drove off, swapped out the donut, started driving, contemplating my next move. It was December, and I was not about to brave the Shasta Mountain Pass on a donut, nor try and drive on that rubber thing the rest of the 10 hours home. But I really needed to get home. I searched tyre shops, but everyone I found was closed because it was Sunday. Then it dawned on me to search Walmart. I know I could be cutting it close, but I thought that if I could just make it to Sacramento in time, I could get a cheap full-size tyre at the auto centre before they close so I can make it home that night. I pulled in with about 20 minutes to spare and explained my situation to the very kind grandfatherly man working there. I let him know that I wanted to keep the flat tyre to return to the rental company, just in case. As I was waiting in the dingy Walmart Auto Centre lobby, the old man walked in with a very serious look on his face, holding a pair of pliers in his hand. Clasped between the metal pliers was a box blade. He asked me if I'd gotten into any altercations or made someone angry. Completely puzzled, I said no. I'm not from around here, and I was just passing through. He said that it was almost impossible for the blade to have been lodged in my tyre in the fashion in which it was. He asked if I had noticed anyone following, with an infliction of concern in his voice that made my blood run cold. And to be honest, I'd been so preoccupied with figuring out my next move, I wouldn't have noticed if someone had been following me. My mind immediately went back to the old overly pushy men at the gas station. As I thought about it more intently, they didn't actually stop at the gas station, they just pulled in next to my car and then left. I stuttered and, I don't know, to the old man. And he told me to take it for a drive around the building and into the neighbourhood and watch my rearview mirror. He instructed me to pull back into the mechanic bay and honk, explaining that they'll come out. He told me that this was an all too common ploy used on that stretch of highway. He explained how these people will insert the blade just enough to get people to break down on the deserted stretches in between the small towns. I thanked him profusely and got back into my rental to test the waters. Luckily, after a few erratic lefts and rights, nothing seemed to be out of the ordinary, so I looped back onto the highway and pressed on into the night. The dark, desolate highway loomed in a more threatening manner as every nerve in my body was on high alert. It wasn't until I was on the road for 15 minutes when I saw the same car from earlier. I started to freak out, but I kept looking back and kept on driving, but kept looking back occasionally. They ended up following me for 2 whole hours until they eventually got off on an exit. I've never been targeted before and I'm pretty generally aware of my surroundings. I still don't know what these people are up to, but it was definitely no good. This experience definitely rattled my false sense of immortality. To all those driving along the I-5 stretch past Bakersfield alone, be mindful of where you stop in emergencies. I try not to think about what could have happened if my independent ego had overridden my gut instinct and I stopped on the shoulder instead. I am female and I am originally from Denmark, but I moved to America in 2009. I studied English since I was in the 3rd grade because I've always wanted to visit America. When I was just a kid, I wanted to go there for fun, but as I got older, my reasons for going there changed. I love my home country, but the truth is, there are limited opportunities there. When I was 19, I decided that I would get out of there. I wanted to make a better life for myself, and I was tired of being broke and cold. I was eventually accepted into a college in San Francisco, but finding a place to stay was difficult. Everywhere I looked was out of my price range. By chance, a friend of mine put me in contact with a family member of his who happened to live in Oakland, which is the city east of San Francisco. I'll call this man George, and George was also from Denmark like me, but he moved away and started a family in California. Since our stories were similar, he agreed to take me in until I found another arrangement. My room is on the ground level and overlooked the backyard. At first, things were going great. I know that Oakland has a reputation for being a tough place and kind of rough, but the area that we lived in was really very nice. I wasn't really into American football before I came here, but George was a die-hard Raiders fan. He explained to me that in order to assimilate into the American culture, I had to pick a football team to root for, and he said to me that if I rooted for any other team aside from the Raiders, that I would have to find somewhere else to stay. George's wife wanted to take a trip down to Houston to visit her parents. George agreed under the condition that they would go see the Raiders play against the Texans while they were down there, so they would be gone for about a week. This was around early October. 2 days after they left, I was up late studying for some upcoming exams. There was a nice breeze out for that night, so I kept the window open. I must have dozed off at my desk, which has happened many times before, because when I awoke, I was still sitting in my computer chair. I was about to get up when I heard a sound that sent chills up my back. Someone was breathing right behind me. I quickly stood up, but before I could scream, I felt a hand covering my mouth, followed by a blade against my neck. "You make a sound and I'll bleed you dry," a voice said. Words cannot describe how scared I was in that moment. There was a mirror in front of my desk and I saw my own terrified face in its reflection. The person behind me had a black mask on with a hood over his head. "We're going to move over to the window. Blink once if you understand me." I blinked. "Good. If you cooperate, you won't get hurt." Next to the window there was a lamp that sat on top of the nightstand. It had a thick glass base, and the switch was broken. The only way to turn it on and off was either to plug it in or unplug it, and at that moment, it was off. This will be important to remember before we get to what happened next. As we moved next to the window, the voice spoke again. "I have a gun on me, so don't try anything." As soon as he said that, he lowered the blade off of my neck. I didn't know if he had a gun or not, or if he was just bluffing. But regardless, he would need at least a couple of seconds to pull it out, and I wasn't going to give him that chance. I quickly grabbed the lamp off the nightstand and smashed it over his head. I then jumped out of the window and raced towards the nearest neighbour's house. I heard an angry shout from behind me, but I didn't look back. I woke up the neighbour by pounding on his door like a crazy person. Soon the police were called, and they showed up there about 10 minutes later. They searched George's house from top to bottom, but there were no signs of the intruder, and thankfully nothing seemed to be missing. That kind of unnerved me because that meant he specifically came in to kidnap me and wasn't interested in anything else. I'm afraid I'm going to have to end this story with the same old, "They never found the bad guy." But there is a bit of hope because they did find a big red bloodstain by the window along with the broken pieces of the lamp, which were taken as evidence, so if he commits another crime, they will have his DNA on file. Since it's been over a decade, I think I knocked some sense into him. I got the feeling that he was nervous about what he was doing, and me smashing the lamp over his head was a wake-up call for him. By the way, if you're wondering, the Raiders got absolutely destroyed in Texas, 29-6.